Ranger Ellis Carver had spent 9 years patrolling the wetlands of Marrow Swamp Preserve, a stretch of cypress and black water that sat at the edge of the county like something the rest of the world had quietly agreed to forget about. He knew the preserve the way other men knew a favorite chair, every sunken log, every channel that looked passable and was not, every stand of cypress knees that could turn an ankle if a man was not watching his feet. He had heard, over the years, the usual stories that swamps collect the way still water collects leaves. Stories of lights that moved where no lantern should be. Stories of something tall and pale that the old-timers in town called the rake, a name passed down from trappers 100 years gone, spoken usually with a laugh, the way men speak of things they do not actually believe in order to prove to themselves and everyone listening that they are not afraid. Ellis had laughed along with the rest of them for 9 years. He stopped laughing on the morning this story begins. The call came in just after dawn, a fisherman reporting strange tracks along the Eastern Channel, tracks he described over the radio as too large and too strange to belong to any animal native to the area. Ellis took the report the way he took most reports, with mild professional interest and no real concern, and loaded his gear into the airboat to go take a look before the morning heat made the swamp unbearable. He found the tracks exactly where the fisherman had described them, pressed deep into the soft mud along the channel bank, and the moment he crouched to examine them, the easy professional calm he had carried into the swamp that morning began to drain out of him. The print was easily 3 feet long, narrow at the heel and splayed wide at what might have been toes, though the shape bore no real resemblance to any toe Ellis had ever studied in 9 years of tracking wildlife through this preserve. He photographed the tracks and followed them along the bank for nearly a quarter-mile before they turned sharply into the deeper cypress stands and vanished into standing water too deep and too dark to hold any further impression. The stride length between prints, measured carefully with his own boot for reference, was longer than seemed possible for anything moving on 2 legs, longer even than seemed possible for most things moving on 4. He radioed the station and reported the tracks as likely belonging to an alligator or large feral hog disturbed by recent flooding, a conclusion he did not believe even as the words left his mouth. He told himself the lie because the alternative, that something walked through Marrow Swamp on 2 legs with a stride that long, was not a thought he wanted living in his head while he still had 8 more hours of solitary patrol ahead of him. The day passed without further incident, and by late afternoon Ellis had nearly convinced himself the tracks were some trick of erosion and shifting mud, the kind of thing the swamp produced from time to time that looked far stranger in the moment than it ever turned out to be once explained. He guided the airboat back toward the eastern dock as the light began to fail, the cypress trees throwing long ragged shadows across the black water, and that was when he heard it for the first time, a low groaning call from somewhere deep in the trees, not quite animal and not quite anything else he could name. He cut the engine and sat listening, the swamp around him gone unnaturally still, no frogs, no insects, no birds settling for the evening, only that single call hanging in the heavy air and then nothing at all. He told himself it was a heron or a gator bellowing for a mate, and he restarted the engine and finished the ride back to the dock faster than he usually allowed himself to go. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his small cabin at the ranger station replaying the sound in his memory, trying to fit it into the shape of something he already understood, and failing every time. Around midnight he got up and pulled the old preserve logbooks from the station's back closet, dusty ledgers going back decades, full of routine notes about water levels and wildlife counts and the occasional lost hiker. Buried among the routine entries he found, scattered across nearly 40 years, a handful of strange reports written in the careful hand of rangers long since retired or passed on. Reports of a tall pale figure seen at the edge of torchlight. Reports of livestock from the nearby farms found torn apart in ways no predator on record could explain. One entry, dated decades earlier, simply read in cramped handwriting that the men in town call it the rake, and God help whoever meets it in the deep hollow after dark. Ellis closed the logbook and sat for a long while in the quiet of the station, the old building creaking gently around him the way old wooden buildings do at night. And he found himself doing something he had not done in years, which was genuinely afraid of the place he called home. He told himself the entries were old folklore dressed up as official record, the kind of thing bored rangers wrote to entertain themselves on slow nights decades before he was even born. He almost believed it by morning. The sun came up clean and bright over the cypress canopy, burning off the fear the way it burned off the morning mist, and Ellis went about his patrol that day with something close to his old confidence restored. It was not until 3 days later, when the second report came in, that the fear returned in full and refused, this time, to leave. The second report came from a group of campers who had set up at the edge of the preserve's southern boundary, a popular spot for fishing trips despite the swamp's reputation. One of the group, a man in his 30s named Howard Pruitt, called the station in a state close to panic, saying something enormous had circled their camp for most of the previous night, something he described as pale and impossibly tall, moving between the trees on long thin limbs that bent in places limbs should not bend. Ellis drove out to meet them immediately. He found the group packing their gear with shaking hands, refusing to spend even another hour in the preserve regardless of the daylight outside. Howard told him, in a voice still tight with leftover terror, that the thing had stood at the very edge of their fire's light for nearly 10 minutes without moving, simply watching, before melting back into the dark as silently as it had appeared. Ellis asked Howard how tall the thing had seemed, expecting an exaggerated guess born of fear and darkness. Howard told him it had stood taller than the cypress trees nearest their camp, trees Ellis knew personally to measure close to 20 feet from root to crown. Ellis did not argue the point, though every rational habit of his training told him to. He had seen the tracks himself. He had heard the call himself. He no longer had the luxury of dismissing a frightened man's estimate simply because it sounded impossible. He helped the group finish breaking camp and escorted them out of the preserve himself, staying well past the end of his shift to make certain they reached their vehicles safely. Driving back to the station alone afterward, in the gathering dusk, he found himself watching the tree line on either side of the road with an attention he had never needed to give it before. Over the following 2 weeks, Ellis began documenting every strange sign he came across with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. He found more tracks, always near standing water, always with that same impossibly long stride. He found trees scarred at heights of 15 feet or more with long parallel gouges that looked, when he forced himself to consider them honestly, exactly like claw marks dragged downward by something reaching from a considerable height. He told no one at the station the full extent of what he was finding, reporting only the parts that could be explained away as large wildlife disturbance, because he understood by now that the full truth would end his career faster than any other mistake he could make. He carried the rest alone, the way a man carries a stone in his pocket that grows heavier every day without ever changing size. The third encounter happened to Ellis directly, late on a humid evening while he was checking water gauges along the northern channel. He heard the low groaning call again, much closer this time, and when he turned his flashlight toward the sound, the beam caught, for one full unmistakable second, a pale shape standing among the cypress trunks at a height that made his stomach drop straight through the floor of the airboat. It did not move when the light struck it. It stood perfectly still, its limbs too long and too thin for its frame, its skin the color of something that had spent its entire existence away from sunlight, and its head, when it finally turned toward the light, held no features Ellis could clearly identify except for a pair of eyes that caught the beam and threw it back with a flat, hungry shine. Ellis cut the light immediately and gunned the airboat engine, and behind him, in the sudden returning dark, he heard the groaning call rise into something closer to a shriek. He did not sleep again that week, not properly, jolting awake at every creak of the old station building, every distant call of a real and ordinary night bird. He requested a transfer out of Marrow Swamp Preserve through proper channels, a request that was denied due to staffing shortages with a promise of reconsideration in the new fiscal year, which felt, to Ellis, like being told to simply survive a little longer before help might arrive. He considered quitting outright more than once during those sleepless nights, and each time some old stubborn part of him refused, the same part that had chosen this work 9 years earlier because he loved the swamp more than he feared anything that might live inside it. He told himself, lying awake and listening to the building creak, that he would simply be more careful, that careful men survived dangerous places all the time. He did not yet understand how completely the swamp intended to test that belief. The test came on a Friday in early autumn, when a missing persons call pulled him deep into the preserve after dark for the first time since the encounter at the northern channel. A teenage boy had wandered off from a family picnic near the western treeline and had not returned by sundown, and Ellis, as the only ranger on duty and the man who knew the preserve best, had no real choice but to go looking, however much every instinct in his body argued against it. He took the airboat as far as the water allowed and then continued on foot, flashlight in one hand and radio in the other, calling the boy's name into a swamp that had gone, once again, unnaturally quiet around him. He told himself the quiet meant nothing, that swamps simply went still sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with anything watching from the dark. He did not believe himself even slightly. He found the boy nearly 2 hours later, crouched and shaking inside the hollow of a massive fallen cypress, unhurt but utterly unable to speak coherently about what had driven him there. Ellis got him calm enough to walk, wrapped him in his own jacket against the night chill, and began the long walk back toward the airboat, the boy's hand gripped tight in his own the way a father might grip a child's hand crossing a busy street. They were perhaps halfway back when the groaning call rose again, closer than Ellis had ever heard it, seeming to come from every direction of the swamp at once, and the boy's grip on his hand tightened to the point of pain. Ellis swung his flashlight in a wide arc and caught, for one terrible heartbeat, the pale shape moving between two distant trunks, far too quickly for something its size to move so silently. He pulled the boy into a run, choosing speed over caution for the first time in his career, crashing through brush and standing water with a complete disregard for the careful habits of 9 years of training. Behind them the groaning call rose into a full shrieking cry, and the sound of something enormous moving through the trees followed close on their heels, branches snapping under a weight that should have been impossible to move so fast. They reached the airboat with seconds to spare, and Ellis shoved the boy into the seat and gunned the engine before he had even fully climbed in himself, the boat lurching forward across the black water as something vast and pale broke from the treeline behind them, standing at the water's edge for one suspended moment before the distance between them finally grew too great for even its long-reaching limbs to close. He delivered the boy safely to his frantic parents at the dock and reported the rescue through proper channels, leaving out, as he had learned to do, the parts of the story that no official report had room to hold. He drove home that night shaking in a way he had not shaken since his first week on the job nearly a decade earlier, and he understood, lying awake afterward, that the swamp had stopped merely testing him and had begun, in some patient and deliberate way, hunting him specifically. He considered, more seriously than ever before, simply walking away from the job entirely regardless of what it cost him. He did not walk away. Some combination of duty and stubborn pride kept him at his post through the following days, and it was that same combination, he would later understand, that led him directly into the worst night of his life only a week later. The final call came in the worst possible way, a report of a hiker overdue from a solo trip into the deep hollow at the preserve's most remote southern edge, a section of swamp so thick with cypress and standing water that almost no one attempted it without a guide. Ellis knew immediately, hearing the location, that this was exactly the kind of place the old logbook entries had warned about decades earlier, the deep hollow where God help whoever meets it after dark. He went anyway because that was the job, and because some part of him, the same part that had spent 9 years loving this swamp before learning to fear it, refused to let a stranger face that hollow alone if there was any chance Ellis could reach them first. He left a message with the station detailing exactly where he was headed, a precaution he had never bothered with before that week, and pushed the airboat as far into the deep hollow as the failing light and thickening water would allow. He continued on foot from where the water grew too shallow and too choked with roots for the boat to pass, calling the missing hiker's name into a swamp that had once again gone perfectly, unnaturally still. The cypress here grew taller and closer together than anywhere else in the preserve, their canopy locking out nearly all the remaining daylight, turning the deep hollow into something closer to permanent dusk even hours before true sunset. He found the hiker's abandoned pack within the first half hour, its straps torn clean through, its contents scattered across the wet ground in a pattern that suggested violence rather than simple carelessness. He found, a short distance further on, a single boot standing upright in the mud, undisturbed and eerily ordinary against the disturbed ground surrounding it, as though its owner had simply stepped out of it and continued on, somehow, without it. He radioed his position and his findings back to the station, his voice steadier than he felt, and continued forward because turning back now, with a missing hiker possibly still alive somewhere ahead, was not a choice his conscience would allow him to make. The light continued to fail around him, the deep hollow's permanent dusk deepening steadily toward true night, and somewhere ahead of him, unmistakably, he heard the low groaning call rise once again. This time it did not stop after a single cry. It rose and fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like breathing, almost like something calling not in alarm or hunger but in simple patient announcement of its own presence, the way a predator that has already won the chase sometimes allows itself the luxury of being heard before it finally closes the distance. Ellis kept his flashlight low and his steps careful, every sense straining against the gathering dark, and it was nearly full night by the time he reached a wide clearing at the very heart of the deep hollow, ringed by cypress trees of truly enormous size, their trunks wider than he had ever seen anywhere else in the preserve. Standing at the far edge of that clearing, motionless and pale against the black water behind it, stood the thing the old-timers called the rake. It was, exactly as Howard Pruitt had described, taller than the surrounding trees, its limbs absurdly long and thin, bending at angles no human joint could manage, its skin the bleached white of something that had spent generations away from any sun. It did not move when his flashlight beam found it fully for the first time. It simply turned its featureless head slowly toward him, and Ellis understood, with a clarity that froze him in place, that he had finally walked directly into the place this thing called home. He did not see the missing hiker anywhere in the clearing, and some cold, logical part of his mind told him, without needing further proof, exactly what that absence meant. He forced that thought aside because dwelling on it now would accomplish nothing except costing him the focus he desperately needed to survive the next several minutes. And survival had become, in this single terrible moment, his only remaining priority. The creature took one slow step forward, its long limb folding and unfolding in a motion that made Ellis's stomach turn, and the groaning call rose again from somewhere deep in its throat, no longer distant or ambiguous but close enough now that he could feel the low vibration of it pressing against his own chest. He backed away one careful step at a time, refusing to turn and run yet, some old instinct warning him that running too soon, before he understood the shape of the threat, would only get him killed faster. It was the creature that broke the standoff first, surging forward across the clearing with a speed that bore no relationship at all to its impossible size, closing 30 feet of distance in what felt like a single heartbeat. Ellis turned and ran then, all caution abandoned, crashing through standing water and cypress roots with the same desperate disregard for his own safety that had carried him and the missing boy back to the airboat a week earlier. Behind him the swamp itself seemed to come alive with the sound of the chase, water churning, branches snapping, the groaning call rising into a full predatory shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing strangely off the close-packed trunks until Ellis could no longer be certain which direction the sound, or the thing making it, was actually coming from. He lost the trail back toward the airboat almost immediately, the deep hollow's identical cypress trunks and flooded ground offering no clear landmark to navigate by in the near total darkness, every familiar shape he tried to use as a guide dissolving into yet another stretch of indistinguishable swamp the moment he reached it. He understood, with a sinking dread that nearly stopped him cold, that he was now thoroughly and dangerously lost in the one part of the preserve he had always avoided learning too well, precisely because the old-timers had always warned him to leave it alone. The shrieking behind him faded for a stretch, long enough that Ellis allowed himself to slow to a labored walk, lungs burning, legs trembling with exhaustion. He did not believe for one moment that the silence meant the creature had given up. He understood it meant only that the chase had changed shape, becoming something slower and far more patient than the desperate sprint of the past several minutes. He spent the remainder of that first night moving in what he hoped was a consistent direction, using the position of what stars he could glimpse through the thick canopy whenever the trees broke enough to allow it. Twice during those long dark hours he heard the groaning call drift past at a distance, never quite close enough to see, never quite far enough away to let him fully relax. And both times he froze completely still until the sound passed and the ordinary insect noise of the swamp slowly, cautiously returned around him. Dawn found him exhausted and soaked through, sitting against the wide buttressed roots of an ancient cypress, his radio finally regaining enough signal to reach the station and report his situation. The voice on the other end promised a search party within the hour, and Ellis allowed himself, for the first time since entering the deep hollow, a small fragile measure of hope that he might actually walk out of this alive. The search party that reached the edge of the deep hollow within the hour found no trace of Ellis Carver waiting for them at the coordinates he had given, only his radio lying in shallow water at the base of the cypress where he had made the call, its casing cracked, its antenna snapped clean off. They found, nearby, a single fresh set of tracks pressed deep into the mud, the same impossible 3-foot length Ellis himself had documented weeks earlier, leading away into water too deep for the search party to safely follow without proper equipment. What none of the search party knew, because Ellis had no way left to tell them, was that the creature had returned just minutes after his radio call, drawn perhaps by the sound of his voice carrying through the still morning air, and that he had been forced once again into a desperate retreat deeper into the hollow rather than back toward any hope of rescue. Ellis ran for what felt like hours through ground that grew steadily wetter and more treacherous, sinking past his knees in places, forcing him to drag each step free with effort that left his arms shaking nearly as badly as his legs. The creature did not press the chase at full speed this time, content instead to herd him steadily deeper into terrain that worked against him with every step, exactly the way the thing that had hunted Cole Ashby through a different forest, far to the north, had once done to a man Ellis had never heard of and never would. By midday he had lost all clear sense of direction entirely, the sun directly overhead offering no useful guidance through the thick canopy, every stretch of black water and cypress knee beginning to look exactly like the last. He stopped, finally, forcing himself to think rather than simply run, and made the decision that would define the rest of his ordeal. He climbed. He found a cypress wide enough and old enough to offer real handholds among its buttressed roots and ascended as high as his exhausted body would allow, settling into a wide fork perhaps 30 feet above the standing water, high enough, he hoped, to be both hidden and safe from anything that hunted primarily along the ground. From this height he could finally see something of the hollow's true shape, an unbroken sweep of identical cypress and black water stretching in every direction with no clear edge, no hint of higher dry ground, no sign of the channel that would have led him home. He stayed in that tree through the long heat of the afternoon, sipping carefully from the small water bottle still clipped to his belt, watching the swamp below for any sign of pale movement. Twice he caught a glimpse of something large shifting between distant trunks, never quite close enough to confirm, and both times his entire body went rigid with a fear that left him shaking long after the shape had passed from view. He spent that second night in the tree, exhausted past the point of real sleep, drifting in and out of a thin, uneasy doze broken every time a real or imagined sound below jolted him fully awake. Somewhere in the deepest hour of that night he heard the groaning call rise directly beneath him, close enough that he could feel the vibration of it through the trunk at his back, and he held his breath and did not move a single muscle until the sound finally, slowly, faded back into the dark. By the third day, hunger and exhaustion had begun to wear away at the edges of his judgment, the same way they had worn away at other men in other forests facing other patient hungers. He descended from the tree near midday, driven by simple desperate need, and began moving again, choosing a direction at random because any direction felt better than staying still and slowly starving 30 feet above the only ground he had. He walked the rest of that day in a state somewhere between waking and dreaming, his thoughts returning again and again to the missing hiker's single abandoned boot standing upright in the mud, to Howard Pruitt's shaking voice describing something taller than the trees, to the old logbook entry written decades earlier in a careful frightened hand. He understood, walking through the heavy heat of that long afternoon, that he had become exactly what that old entry had warned about, a man who had met the rake in the deep hollow after dark and had been left, ever since, to discover for himself what that meeting actually cost. Near dusk on the third day he finally heard, faint but unmistakable, the distant sound of an airboat engine somewhere to the east, and he turned toward it with every remaining scrap of strength his body had left to give, half running, half stumbling through the shallow water, calling out with a voice gone hoarse and raw from days of disuse. The search team found him collapsed at the edge of a wider channel just as full dark settled over the preserve, soaked, scratched, badly dehydrated, but unmistakably alive, and the relief on their faces when their lights found him was a thing Ellis would remember for the rest of his life with a gratitude that never fully faded. He did not tell them everything that had happened in the deep hollow. He told them enough to be believed without being dismissed. A careful balance he had learned over the previous 3 days mattered more than almost anything else if he wanted to keep both his sanity and his job. The missing hiker was never found. The official report, after considerable internal debate that Ellis was never fully briefed on, listed the disappearance as a probable drowning, the kind of conclusion that closed a file without requiring anyone to write down the truth that several people now privately suspected but could not bring themselves to put into an official record. Ellis Carver did not quit his post at Marrow Swamp Preserve, though every reasonable argument available to him suggested that he should. He stayed instead, choosing to remain the one ranger on staff who genuinely understood what walked the deep hollow after dark, because he had come, somewhere during those 3 terrible days in the swamp, to believe that a preserve with no one who truly understood its dangers was a far more dangerous place than a preserve with one frightened man who did. He changed how he worked after that. He stopped patrolling the southern boundary alone after sunset under any circumstance, and he made certain, every single time a new ranger transferred into the station, to walk them personally to the edge of the deep hollow on their very first week and tell them plainly, without embellishment and without expecting to be believed, exactly what the old-timers had always called the pale thing that lived there, and exactly why no one, under any circumstance, should ever go looking for it after. If you like this video, like and subscribe for more.